When a group of friends visited Disneyland for what was supposed to be a New Year's treat, they were expecting a day's fun at the so-called happiest place on Earth. But a ride on the Matterhorn bobsleds would leave one person dead in what would prove to be one of the most horrific, disturbing, and unexplainable accidents in Disneyland history and spark a 4-year lawsuit. This is the story of the Matterhorn bobsled tragedy. Disneyland Park, originally and perhaps more fondly known as Disneyland, is the original Disney theme park opened in July of 1955. Built at Disneyland Resort in Anaheim, Disneyland Park is owned and operated by the Walt Disney Company, created by brothers Walt and Roy Disney. Arguably the world's most famous theme park, it sees almost 20 million guests each year. Separated into 9 themed areas, these are Adventureland, designed to recreate the feel of an exotic tropical place in a faraway region; New Orleans Square, based on 19th century New Orleans and home to the Pirates of the Caribbean and the Haunted Mansion. On Main Street, USA, you'll find the iconic Sleeping Beauty Castle. Then there's Mickey Mouse Toontown, Frontierland, Critter Country, the Star Wars section, Fantasyland, and Tomorrowland. It's on the border of Fantasyland and Tomorrowland that you'll find one of the park's most iconic and oldest attractions, the Matterhorn bobsleds. Opened on June 14th, 1959, the Matterhorn bobsleds are modelled on the Matterhorn, a mountain on the border between Switzerland and Italy. Built by Arrow Developments, the Matterhorn is unique in that it's actually 2 rides running parallel and intertwined, simulating a bobsled race around the mountain. At the time of opening, the Skyway gondola passed through the mountain. Throughout the roughly 2.5-minute ride time, riders reach a peak height of 80 feet and a top speed of around 27 miles per hour. At peak times, there are 20 bobsleds consisting of 2 cars each. The bobsleds depart roughly 30 seconds apart, an important point later in this story. To hold riders in, at the time of the ride's opening, Disneyland used belts that slipped through a buckle, which closed down on top of it with a friction fastener. These belts, however, would come under the spotlight on more than one occasion. On the 3rd of January 1984, 48-year-old Dolly Regina Young of Fremont visited Disneyland for a New Year's treat with 5 friends. It's worth noting that at the time of Dolly's visit, due to a recent law change, guest safety was unregulated in California. The parks were left to self-regulate. At around 3:30 p.m., Dolly and her friends rode the Matterhorn. Dolly sat alone in the rear of the second car. At this point, before the ride departs, it's standard operating procedure for a Disneyland ride operator to check that the seat belt of each passenger is fastened. This should always be done twice before the ride departs. Back in 1984, the Skyway gondola passed through the Matterhorn. Riders aboard the gondola could catch a glimpse of those riding the bobsleds below them. Dolly and her friends were roughly 1 minute through the ride on the bobsleds when the gondola, carrying a family of 3, Don Pishner and his 2 daughters, reached the Matterhorn. As one of the daughters looked down upon the roller coaster, she screamed and said, "Oh my God, someone fell out of that car." Her father looked down and saw that Dolly had fallen out of the bobsled and was now lying on the coaster tracks. Although Dolly was bruised and shaken, for the time being, however, she was okay, and she tried to get up and remove herself from harm's way. Watching in horror from the gondola above, Don yelled for his 2 daughters not to look as he spotted the next bobsled fast approaching Dolly. A Canadian family were riding in the oncoming bobsled. For a moment, they assumed the person lying on the tracks was a prop. As they got closer, however, reality set in. At almost full speed, the bobsled struck Dolly, killing her instantly and trapping the bobsled on top of her in what can only be described as a scene from a horror movie. Sensing a bobsled was stuck, the ride shut down automatically. That, combined with the screaming, alerted ride operators that something was horribly wrong. A ride operator raced to the spot of the accident. Upon witnessing the gruesome scene, he raced back down for help, warning fellow workers not to go look. Police and ambulance were soon on the scene and Dolly was pronounced dead, although the terrible sight in front of them had left little doubt. Upon inspection of the scene, police noted that Dolly's seatbelt was open and lying on her seat. The question for them was, did Dolly undo her own seatbelt halfway through the ride, or had ride operators failed to ensure it was done up before the ride had departed? The Anaheim Police Department launched an investigation into the accident. Disney said there was no chance Dolly could have left the station without her seatbelt done up. It was standard protocol for ride operators to check guests twice to ensure all seatbelts were fastened. However, Dolly's husband was unsatisfied with Disney's response, saying, "My wife was not a frivolous or daring person. She was not some young kid that would have stood up on the ride." He was adamant Dolly would not have undone her own seatbelt during the ride. Somewhat interestingly, the incident was not the first of its kind on the Matterhorn at Disneyland. Almost 20 years earlier, in May of 1964, just 5 years after the ride opened, 15-year-old Mark Maple was riding the Matterhorn when he also fell from the ride. After striking his head on the side of the concrete mountain, he tumbled out of the bobsled. Sadly, he would die 4 days later. In this case, as in Dolly's, Disneyland insisted the victim had undone his own seatbelt. In the weeks following Dolly's death, Disneyland replaced the seatbelts used on the Matterhorn, opting for a different kind. However, Disneyland insisted the change had nothing to do with the accident. In the months that followed, Dolly's husband filed a $5 million wrongful death lawsuit against Disneyland, claiming the ride operators allowed the ride to depart without checking Dolly's seatbelt. Disneyland denied the allegations. It was reported that at the time of the incident, Disneyland defended around 50 cases of negligence each year, with the vast majority settled out of court. 4 years after the accident, and with threats from Dolly's husband to release pictures of the accident, Disneyland sought an out-of-court settlement, with both parties barred from discussing details. Since the deaths of Mark Maple and Dolly Young, and the changing of the ride's seatbelts, there have been no further fatal incidents on the Matterhorn at Disneyland. That's all for today's video. If you found value in it, I'd love it if you subscribed and joined me for the next one. To learn about another accident at Six Flags over Texas, you can click the link on screen. And as always, thanks for watching.